You'll thank me someday? I'm doing you a favor. Brendan Ashford's words echoed across the infinity pool as he slid divorce papers onto the wet tiles beside my lounger. His iPhone screen glowed with a group chat notification. BRO. You actually did it. The tropical Bali sunset painted everything in shades of gold and crimson, but all I could see was the blonde woman in designer sunglasses watching from the private cabana behind him. She raised her champagne glass in what looked like a toast. To what? My humiliation? Their victory. That moment, 6 months ago now, replays in my mind as I stand backstage at Providence General Hospital's Grand Meridian Ballroom, clutching a USB drive that weighs nothing but feels like it could crush mountains. Through the velvet curtains, I can see 300 guests in black tie finery, crystal chandeliers refracting light across tables laden with orchid centerpieces. Somewhere in that crowd sits Brendan Ashford, pharmaceutical sales director, healthcare hero award recipient, and the man who gambled $10,000 on whether he could marry me and discard me within 12 months. He has no idea I'm about to present his award. More importantly, he has no idea what I've spent the last 6 months building. The pool deck in Bali was where Brendan thought he'd written the ending to our story. Tonight, I'm about to show him that some women don't write endings. They write reckonings. The stage manager taps my shoulder. 5 minutes, my hands should be shaking. But they're steady. Years of pediatric ICU nursing taught me how to function when stakes are life and death. This? This is just justice dressed in evening wear. I smooth down my midnight blue gown, the one I bought with my first paycheck from my new position, not with money from any man, and take a breath that tastes like vindication. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why tonight matters, you need to understand how a poolside betrayal in paradise became a federal case that would destroy not just a marriage, but an entire network of corruption. You need to understand how the nice pediatric nurse everyone underestimated became the woman who brought pharmaceutical fraud to its knees. Let me take you back to where it really began. Not to Bali, but to the moment I made the mistake of believing that love and ambition could coexist without someone turning it into a transaction. It started 18 months ago in the pediatric wing of Providence General, where I'd worked for 7 years. I was good at my job, the kind of good that made parents request me specifically for their children's care, the kind that made attending physicians trust my instincts during critical moments. But I'd always been invisible in a different way. Not the kind of invisible that suggests incompetence, but the kind that comes from being so focused on your work that you forget to market yourself, to network, to play the games that turn competence into recognition. Brendan appeared during a pharmaceutical company presentation about a new pediatric medication protocol. He stood at the front of the conference room in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, delivering his pitch with the kind of charisma that made even skeptical doctors lean forward in their seats. I barely paid attention to the drug details. I was too busy taking notes on the statistical claims, mentally cross-referencing them with patient outcomes I'd observed. When he asked for questions, I raised my hand. Your efficacy data shows a 92% improvement rate, I said, keeping my tone professional despite the fact that his eyes had locked onto mine with unsettling intensity. But the sample size was only 47 patients across 3 facilities. How do you account for the variance in care protocols between institutions? That seems like too small a pool to draw definitive conclusions for widespread pediatric application. The room went quiet. Junior nurses didn't usually challenge pharmaceutical reps, especially not with statistical methodology questions. Brendan's smile never wavered. But something shifted in his expression. A spark of what I mistook for respect, but would later recognize as calculation. That's an excellent observation, he replied, and I felt the room's attention shift to me for the first time in years. Why don't we continue this conversation over coffee? I'd love to hear more of your insights on pediatric care standards, Miss Calloway, Nora Calloway. The words felt small in my mouth, unpracticed. I wasn't used to this kind of attention from someone like him, someone who commanded rooms with nothing but presence and polish. Nora. He repeated my name like he was tasting it, testing its weight. Coffee tomorrow? There's a place across from the hospital. 9 a.m. I should have said no. I should have recognized the way his eyes lingered, not on my face, but on my name badge, on my worn but functional work shoes, on the absence of expensive jewelry or designer accessories. I should have understood that he was cataloging me, assessing me, determining my market value in whatever equation he was running in his head. Instead, I said yes, because for once, someone who seemed to matter had noticed me for my mind, rather than just my ability to manage IV drips and comfort crying children. Coffee became lunch. Lunch became dinner at restaurants I'd only read about in lifestyle magazines. Brendan was attentive in ways I'd never experienced. He remembered that I took my tea with honey instead of sugar, that I'd mentioned wanting to visit the botanical gardens, that my younger brother had struggled with addiction and inspired my interest in pediatric care. Every detail I offered, he collected like precious gems, building a portrait of who I was that felt more vivid and valued than anything I'd constructed for myself. You're different from the people in my world, he told me, 6 weeks into our whirlwind courtship. Over wine at a rooftop restaurant where the city lights competed with the stars. His hand covered mine on the white tablecloth, warm and solid. Everyone I meet wants something. Connections, money, status. You just want to help people. It's refreshing. You're real. Real. The word stuck with me because I'd spent so long feeling invisible that being seen as authentic felt like the ultimate compliment. What I didn't understand then was that real was part of his pitch, part of the narrative he was constructing. I wasn't real to him. I was a role he needed filled, a character in a script where he'd already written the ending. The proposal came 3 months later, during a hospital charity gala where Brendan had purchased a table for his pharmaceutical company's executive team. He'd insisted I attend as his guest, lending me money for a gown that made me feel like I was playing dress-up in someone else's life. Midway through dinner, he stood, tapped his glass with a knife until conversation died, and turned to me with a box in his hand. "Nora Calloway," he began, and his voice carried across the ballroom with practiced ease. "You've shown me what it means to live with purpose beyond profit margins and sales quotas. You've reminded me that the most important metrics aren't measured in revenue, but in lives changed, children saved, hope restored. Will you marry me?" The room erupted in applause before I could even process the question. Cameras flashed. His colleagues cheered. The hospital administrator, who'd barely acknowledged my existence for 7 years, suddenly beamed at me like I'd performed a medical miracle. In that moment, surrounded by affirmation and attention, I said yes. Not because I'd carefully considered whether Brendan and I were truly compatible, not because I'd asked the hard questions about our future, but because, for the first time in my life, I felt like I mattered in spaces beyond hospital rooms and patient charts. The engagement transformed my status overnight. Suddenly, senior nurses who'd ignored me invited me to lunch. Hospital administrators asked my opinion on pediatric wing improvements. Brendan's colleagues treated me with deference that felt simultaneously flattering and uncomfortable, like wearing shoes 2 sizes too large. I attributed the change to Brendan's influence, to doors opening because of his connections. It never occurred to me that I was being watched for entertainment value, that my relationship was a spectator sport with betting stakes. The wedding happened fast. Brendan insisted we had no reason to wait. 6 weeks of planning compressed into a ceremony at an upscale hotel ballroom, guest list dominated by his pharmaceutical connections and country club associates. My side of the church was sparse. A few nursing colleagues, my brother who showed up sober but clearly uncomfortable in formal wear, some childhood friends I'd lost touch with over the years. Brendan's mother, Evelyn, arrived in a hat that cost more than my car, air kissing my cheeks while her eyes assessed me like livestock at auction. So lovely that Brendan found someone so grounded, she murmured. The pause before grounded, loaded with implications I was too nervous to decode. These career women with their own ambitions can be so exhausting. It's nice he chose someone who will appreciate what he can provide. I smiled through the backhanded compliment because I didn't yet have the vocabulary to defend myself against people who wielded politeness like weapons. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of flash photography and champagne toasts. Brendan's college friend Trent Holloway delivered a best man speech full of inside jokes about successful ventures and calculated risks that made the groomsmen laugh too hard. At the time, I thought they were just drunk. Now I know they were laughing at the punchline of a joke where I was the setup. The Bali honeymoon was Brendan's choice, a luxury resort owned by some pharmaceutical industry connection, all expenses covered as a wedding gift. I should have questioned why we weren't paying for our own honeymoon, why everything felt orchestrated by invisible hands. Instead, I let myself believe I'd stumbled into a fairy tale, that the nice nurse from the pediatric wing had somehow won the lottery of love. Our villa, perched over crystalline water, private and perfect. The first 2 days followed the script: romantic dinners, couples massages, sunrise walks on pristine sand. But Brendan grew increasingly distracted, checking his phone with growing frequency, disappearing for important calls that couldn't wait. I tried not to take it personally, reminding myself that pharmaceutical sales never slept, that ambitious men made sacrifices for success. On the third afternoon, I was reading by the infinity pool when Brendan emerged from the villa with his iPad under one arm and a manila envelope in his hand. His expression was different, lighter somehow, like he'd just finished a difficult workout and could finally relax. He sat down on the lounger beside me, and for the first time since we'd arrived, I had his complete attention. "Nora," he said, and his tone carried that practiced smoothness I'd mistaken for affection. "We need to talk about something." I set down my book, already trying to guess what serious topic required this level of buildup. Financial planning? Starting a family? Moving to a bigger house? All the conversations I'd imagined married couples eventually had. What I wasn't prepared for was Brendan sliding divorce papers across the wet tiles between us. "What is this?" My voice came out smaller than I intended, confusion not yet hardened into hurt. "This," Brendan gestured at the legal documents, "is me doing you a favor, honestly. You seem like a nice person, Nora. You don't deserve to be dragged through a messy divorce later when things inevitably fall apart. Better to end it clean now, give you a fresh start before you waste more time on something that was never going to work." The words didn't make sense. We'd been married for 3 days. We were on our honeymoon. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. For the moment, he'd laugh and say this was some elaborate prank. Instead, his phone lit up on the table between us. I could see the notification clearly. A group chat message from someone named Trent, his best man, with laughing emojis and a money bag symbol. I don't understand. I was still trying to process this as some kind of miscommunication, some stress-induced breakdown that we could fix with conversation and couples therapy. "Brendan, what's happening?" He sighed. The sound of someone forced to explain something tediously obvious to someone too slow to grasp it. "Look, I'll be straight with you because you've been decent enough, and I don't want to drag this out. About 18 months ago, I made a bet with my fraternity brothers. $10,000 that I couldn't marry someone completely outside my usual type within a year. You were perfect. Wholesome nurse, no family drama to complicate things, just ambitious enough to be flattered by the attention, but not worldly enough to see it coming. If you've ever felt underestimated or dismissed by someone who thought you were too nice to be a threat, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens next is proof that the quiet ones are often the most dangerous. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this story unfolds. The tropical paradise around us, the palm trees swaying in the breeze, the turquoise water sparkling in afternoon sun. the distant sound of resort music. All of it became background noise to the roaring in my ears. I watched Brendan pull up his iPad, casually scrolling to show me a PDF document. It was labeled The Ashford Initiative in professional typography, complete with legal formatting and signature lines. Trent drafted this, Brendan explained, sounding almost proud. He's a corporate lawyer, made sure everything was legally binding. See here, the terms are pretty straightforward. I had to propose within 6 months of our first meeting, marry within 12 months of the proposal, and then provide proof of divorce filing within 30 days of the wedding. The longer I dragged it out, the less interesting the bet became. 3 days is actually a record, according to the guys. They thought I'd cave and wait at least a week before pulling the trigger. I took the iPad with numb fingers, scanning words that should have meant something, but felt like they were written in a language I'd never learned. There were clauses about documentation requirements, proof of marriage specifications, even a section outlining what constituted acceptable grounds for divorce filing to prevent anyone from claiming he'd cheated on the terms. My marriage, the vows I'd meant with every fiber of my being, had been reduced to contract stipulations and payout structures. Why? The question barely made it past my lips. Why me specifically? Brendan's laugh wasn't cruel exactly, just matter of fact, like explaining obvious market research to someone unfamiliar with business strategy. The whole point was proving I could make someone believe it. You were perfect because you're smart enough to be credible, but inexperienced enough to miss the red flags. Women in my usual circles would have smelled this coming a mile away. They've played these games themselves. But you? You actually believed in the fairy tale. That's what made it interesting. He stood, pocketing his phone and leaving the divorce papers on the lounger. The villa's paid for through the end of the week. Consider it a parting gift. You can stay, enjoy Bali, whatever you want. I've got a flight back in 3 hours. Business calls, you understand? Try not to take this too personally, Nora. In a few years, you'll probably even be grateful. This way, you're free to find someone actually suited to your lifestyle. Someone realistic. I watched him walk back toward the villa, his designer sandals leaving perfect prints in the sand that the next wave would wash away. From the private cabana across the pool, the blonde woman in sunglasses emerged. She was stunning in that effortless way that suggested personal trainers and expensive salons, wearing a bikini that probably cost what I made in a week. She intercepted Brendan halfway across the deck, and I watched them kiss. Not the quick peck of new affection, but the practiced ease of established intimacy. Sienna Marlowe. I didn't know her name yet, didn't understand her role in this theater production where I'd been cast as the fool. But I watched her laugh at something Brendan whispered. Watched her glance toward me with an expression that mixed pity and contempt in equal measure, and something shifted in my chest. The initial shock began crystallizing into something colder, sharper, more focused. My hand found my phone in the beach bag beside my lounger. I'd been recording our entire conversation. It was habit from work. Pediatric nurses learned early to document everything, to create paper trails that protected both patients and providers. I'd hit record when Brendan sat down, some instinct warning me that whatever came next would need to be preserved. Now I had 18 minutes of audio capturing every word of his confession, every casual cruelty, every detail of his bet. I took photos too. Brendan's iPad still sat on the lounger, where he'd left it in his haste to leave, and he hadn't locked the screen. I photographed every page of that contract, the terms, the signatures, the payout schedule. I photographed him with Sienna by the cabana, their body language telling the story of a relationship that predated our wedding by months at minimum. When Brendan finally noticed his forgotten iPad and came back to retrieve it, I'd already uploaded everything to my secure cloud storage. "You'll want to sign those papers," he said, gesturing at the divorce documents as he grabbed his iPad. "My lawyers will make it ugly if you contest. Trust me, you don't want to drag this out. Take the easy exit." I looked up at him. this man I'd married 3 days ago, and felt absolutely nothing. The hurt would come later, I knew, in private moments when my guard was down. But right now, sitting beside an infinity pool in paradise with my marriage dissolving before it had properly begun, all I felt was a crystalline clarity that cut through sentiment and reached something harder underneath. "I'll think about it," I said quietly. And Brendan took my compliance as confirmation of my defeat. He smiled. Not the charming smile he'd used during our courtship, but something more genuine and far less pleasant. And walked away for what he assumed was the final time. He left me with divorce papers, a prepaid vacation, and the assumption that I'd crumble quietly into humiliation and obscurity. What he left behind was evidence. What he created was motivation. What he failed to recognize was that the nice pediatric nurse he'd targeted for her authenticity had spent 7 years learning how to function under pressure, how to document everything, how to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. He'd bet that I was too naive to be dangerous. He'd gambled on the wrong woman. The rest of that week in Bali passed in a strange haze of surreal normalcy. I stayed in the villa, not because I wanted to wallow in misery, but because I needed time to think without the pressure of returning to a life that no longer made sense. I went through Brendan's belongings that he'd left behind in his hasty exit, finding more breadcrumbs than I'd anticipated. A receipt from a luxury resort in the Maldives, dated 3 months before our wedding, with 2 guests listed under his reservation. Hotel keycards from business trips he'd claimed were solo conferences, all showing matching checkout times suggesting a companion. Credit card statements he'd printed and left in the villa safe. Our honeymoon fund showed withdrawals I didn't recognize, thousands of dollars in transfers to accounts I'd never heard of. But the most valuable discovery came from his cloud storage. Brendan had synced his iPad to his accounts, without considering that I still had access from when he'd casually let me use it to look up restaurant recommendations during our courtship. I found folders labeled with pharmaceutical company names, subfolders organized by hospital networks, and email chains that made my blood run cold for reasons that had nothing to do with personal betrayal. There were conversations about off-label prescriptions, incentive structures for doctors who pushed certain medications to pediatric patients, kickback arrangements disguised as consulting fees, and speaker honorariums. Brendan wasn't just a pharmaceutical sales director. He was an architect of systemic fraud, convincing medical professionals to prioritize profit over patient care. The same charm he'd used to make me fall in love with him, he'd weaponized to compromise the integrity of hospitals across 3 states. I sat in that Bali villa, looking at evidence of corruption that dwarfed a $10,000 bet, and realized something crucial. Brendan had humiliated me personally, but he was harming people professionally. Children, the same patients I dedicated my career to protecting, were being prescribed medications they didn't need, subjected to treatments that benefited pharmaceutical company bottom lines instead of their health outcomes. The man who'd played games with my heart was playing far more dangerous games with vulnerable lives. That's when I stopped crying. That's when the grief transformed into purpose. Brendan thought he'd won his bet and walked away clean. What he'd actually done was hand me the keys to his entire operation, wrapped in the assumption that I was too brokenhearted and naive to recognize what I was holding. I flew home 5 days later with a carry-on bag full of printed documentation and a cloud drive full of damning evidence. The divorce papers remained unsigned in my luggage, not because I wanted to preserve the marriage, but because I wanted to preserve my legal standing as his spouse. Spousal testimony had different rules than civilian testimony, and I had a feeling those distinctions would matter before this was finished. Providence General Hospital felt different when I walked back through its doors 2 weeks before my scheduled return from honeymoon. The congratulations from colleagues who'd celebrated my wedding felt hollow now, their well wishes about married life landing like minor cuts. I smiled through it all, accepted the casseroles and advice, deflected questions about why I was back early with vague mentions of work commitments. Only Janine Lowe, the hospital administrator who oversaw pediatric operations, seemed to sense something was wrong. She'd been a mentor to me over the years in quiet ways, advocating for my continuing education funding, making sure I got assigned to challenging cases that developed my skills, recognizing competence even when it didn't come packaged in self-promotion. 3 days after my return, she appeared at my locker during a shift change. "You look different," Janine observed, her tone carefully neutral. "Not worse, exactly. Just focused in a way that concerns me." I considered deflecting, but something about Janine's directness invited honesty. If you knew someone was doing something harmful, really harmful to vulnerable people, but exposing them would also expose your own humiliation, would you stay quiet? Janine studied me with the kind of assessment I'd seen her use during budget meetings and staffing crisis negotiations. "Nora, I've known you for 7 years. You've never once prioritized your comfort over doing the right thing for a patient. Why would you start now?" "Because this isn't about patients I can name," I admitted. "It's about a system. And exposing it means everyone knowing that I couldn't finish the sentence. Gullible? Stupid? Too trusting for the world I'd accidentally married into. Used," Janine supplied gently. "Manipulated by someone who saw your decency as a weakness instead of recognizing it as strength." She leaned against the locker beside mine. "Nora, powerful people count on good people staying quiet to avoid embarrassment. That's how they keep winning. Whatever you know, whoever hurt you, don't let shame be their shield." That conversation stayed with me through double shifts and sleepless nights. I started organizing my evidence methodically, creating timelines and cross-references, teaching myself the basics of legal documentation and chain of custody. But I knew I couldn't do this alone. Whatever Brendan was involved in was bigger than one angry spouse could handle. I needed allies, experts, people who understood how to turn evidence into action. That's when I met Dr. Mira Kendrick. It happened 3 weeks after my return, during my lunch break at the hospital cafeteria. I was reviewing medical journals on my tablet, specifically articles about pharmaceutical marketing practices and prescriber behavior, when someone set a coffee cup down across from me at the otherwise empty table. "Pharmacological Ethics in Pediatric Treatment," the woman read from my screen. "Heavy reading for lunch. Mind if I join you?" I looked up to see a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority that felt familiar, but unplaceable. She wasn't wearing scrubs or a white coat, just business casual that suggested she wasn't medical staff. Before I could answer, recognition clicked into place. "You were in Bali," I said slowly. "At the resort. I saw you by the pool bar." Dr. Mira Kendrick smiled. But it wasn't a friendly expression. It was the smile of someone who'd been waiting for this conversation. "I was. And I saw you too, Nora Calloway. Or should I say, Nora Ashford. I heard congratulations were in order, though I notice you're back at work much earlier than typical honeymoon schedules suggest." My instinct was to deflect, to protect my privacy behind polite deflection. But something about Mira's directness and the fact that she tracked me down specifically suggested this wasn't a social call. "I'm keeping my maiden name professionally," I said carefully. "And yes, the honeymoon ended earlier than planned. Work commitments." "Work commitments," Mira repeated, her tone making it clear she didn't believe me for a second. She pulled out her own tablet, opening a file that made my chest tighten with recognition. It was a photograph of Brendan, professional headshot style, with a caption identifying him as a person of interest in an ongoing investigation. "Nora, I'm a medical ethics investigator. I work with state boards and occasionally federal agencies to identify and document healthcare fraud. I was in Bali investigating pharmaceutical kickback schemes that connect back to several companies operating in this region. One of those companies employs your husband." The word husband felt like sand in my mouth. "What kind of investigation?" Mira's expression softened slightly. trading professional distance for something closer to empathy. The kind that takes years to build and requires insider testimony to prosecute successfully. The kind where pharmaceutical companies systematically incentivize doctors to prescribe medications that benefit profit margins over patient outcomes. Your husband, Brendan Ashford, is a key figure in a network we've been tracking across 3 states. His sales records show patterns that don't align with actual patient need. Hospitals, where he has major accounts, show prescription spikes that medical necessity can't explain. I thought about the files I'd found in Bali, the email chains discussing market penetration strategies and prescriber compliance rates. Mira was describing the same system from a different angle, connecting dots I'd only begun to understand. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Because you were married to him for less than a week before coming back alone. And because you're researching pharmaceutical ethics during your lunch break instead of eating." Mira leaned forward, her voice dropping to ensure privacy. "Nora, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I recognize the look of someone who stumbled into information they weren't supposed to have. If you have evidence, any evidence at all, we need to talk. Not here, not now, but soon." She slid a business card across the table. Dr. Mira Kendrick, medical ethics investigator, with contact information for an office I'd never heard of. Think about it. If you decide you want to do something with whatever you know, call me. If you decide to just move on with your life and pretend you never saw anything, I'll understand that too. But know this. Brendan Ashford and people like him count on decent people staying quiet. They count on shame and fear being stronger than justice. Mira stood, picking up her coffee. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry about whatever happened in Bali, based on timeline analysis of when you both arrived versus when only you remained. I can make educated guesses. But here's something to consider. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to us becomes the catalyst for the best thing we ever do." She left me sitting there with her business card and a choice that felt simultaneously impossible and inevitable. I could sign Brendan's divorce papers, take my humiliation privately, and return to the life I'd had before he'd entered it. Safe, invisible, uncomplicated, or I could weaponize my betrayal, transform personal pain into public accountability, and risk becoming the spectacle I'd tried so hard to avoid. I looked around the hospital cafeteria, at the nurses grabbing quick meals between shifts, at the residents studying over cold coffee, at the support staff whose wages barely covered rent, while pharmaceutical executives took home bonuses built on compromised care. I thought about the children in my pediatric wing, the ones whose parents trusted that prescribed medications were necessary and safe, who couldn't possibly know that treatment decisions might be influenced by sales quotas instead of medical need. That evening, I called Mira from my apartment. "What do you need from me?" Her response was immediate, like she'd been waiting by the phone. "Everything you have. Documentation, recordings, anything that connects pharmaceutical sales tactics to prescriber behavior or financial incentives." "And Nora, this won't be easy. People like Brendan don't go down without fighting back. They have resources, lawyers, ways of making witnesses look unreliable or vindictive. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Brendan's face when he'd slid those divorce papers toward me, about his casual cruelty wrapped in the language of favors and kindness. I thought about Sienna watching from the cabana like this was entertainment. I thought about Trent and the fraternity brothers who'd bet money on my heartbreak like it was a sports game. "I'm prepared," I said. "Tell me what happens next." What happened next was 2 months of the most intense work I'd ever done. Mira connected me with Agent Raymond Torres from the FBI's White Collar Crimes Division, a soft-spoken man who took chain of custody seriously and asked questions that revealed decades of investigative experience. We met in anonymous coffee shops and borrowed office spaces. Never at my apartment or anywhere Brendan might have surveillance. Torres walked me through proper documentation procedures, teaching me how to authenticate evidence and establish timeline integrity. My audio recording from Bali became Exhibit A, time-stamped and verified against flight records and hotel check-in data. The photographs of Brendan's betting contract were cross-referenced with Trent Holloway's law firm records, establishing that a practicing attorney had drafted what amounted to a legal document for fraud. But the real breakthrough came from the pharmaceutical files I'd copied from Brendan's cloud storage. Torres connected them with ongoing investigations into kickback schemes, identifying patterns that confirmed suspicions. Federal agents had been building for 2 years. Brendan wasn't just one bad actor. He was part of a coordinated network that spanned multiple companies, hospitals, and states. This is bigger than one sales director's corruption, Torres explained during one of our meetings, spreading printed emails across the conference table. We're looking at systematic fraud that's cost insurance companies millions and put patients at risk. But proving intent is difficult. Sales reps can claim they were just doing their jobs, following company policy. That's where your evidence becomes critical. These emails show conscious decisions to prioritize profit over patient care. They know what they're doing is wrong. And they're doing it anyway. I spent evenings after my hospital shifts compiling witness statements from nurses who'd felt pressured to administer medications they questioned. 3 pediatric nurses came forward, colleagues I'd worked with for years, who admitted they'd felt uncomfortable with prescription patterns, but didn't know how to report concerns without jeopardizing their positions. Their testimony corroborated the patterns Torres had identified in pharmaceutical sales data. Janine helped too, though I didn't tell her everything at first. I asked careful questions about hospital procurement processes, about how pharmaceutical relationships influenced formulary decisions. She provided context I needed to understand the business side of healthcare, the invisible economic pressures that shaped medical decisions in ways patients never saw. There's a gala coming up in 2 months, Janine mentioned during one of our conversations. Annual hospital fundraiser, black tie affair. The pharmaceutical companies sponsor tables, donate to the charity auction. It's a networking event more than anything else, but the board takes it seriously. They announce awards, recognize major donors, that sort of thing. Does Brendan's company sponsor? I asked, already knowing the answer. Janine nodded. They're one of our biggest sponsors. In fact, Brendan himself is receiving an award this year. Healthcare Hero recognition for his contributions to pediatric treatment access. She said it without irony, unaware of the bitter laugh that statement deserved. An idea began forming, dangerous and perfect. Who presents those awards? Usually board members or senior hospital administrators. Why? I met her eyes, letting her see the calculation behind my question. Could you get me on the presenter list? Janine studied me with the same assessment she'd used when I first came back from Bali. Nora, what exactly are you planning? Justice, I said simply. Public, witnessed, undeniable justice. But I need your help. She was quiet for a long moment, weighing professional risk against whatever instinct had made her trust me for 7 years. The gala has 300 attendees, media coverage, board members from 6 hospitals, state health officials. If something were to happen there, it would be very public and very permanent. Exactly. And if I help you, I need to know I'm not facilitating something that will harm the hospital's reputation. I pulled out my tablet, opening the organized files of evidence I'd been compiling. What I'm planning will expose corruption that's already harming the hospital's reputation. You just don't know it yet. Brendan and his company have been systematically compromising the integrity of care here and at 5 other facilities. I have documentation of kickbacks, off-label prescription pressures, and financial incentives that violate every medical ethics standard. The question isn't whether this comes out. It's whether we control how and when it comes out. Janine read through my files with increasing tension in her shoulders. When she finally looked up, her expression had hardened into something resolute. I can get you on the presenter list. I can't protect you if this blows back, but I can give you the platform. The rest is up to you. That conversation happened 6 weeks before the gala. The remaining time passed in a blur of final preparations, coordination with Agent Torres and Dr. Mira Kendrick, and the surreal experience of continuing my regular life while building a case that would destroy Brendan's. I saw him twice during those weeks. Once at the hospital during a pharmaceutical presentation, once at a coffee shop near my apartment. The coffee shop encounter was the more dangerous. Brendan appeared beside my table with a casualness that suggested the meeting was accidental, though his presence at a location I frequented regularly told a different story. He still looked the same. Expensive suit, practiced smile, complete confidence that the world would arrange itself according to his preferences. "Nora," he greeted me like we were old acquaintances rather than estranged spouses. "I heard you were back at work. Glad to see you're moving on with your life." That's healthy. I looked up from my laptop, forcing my expression into polite neutrality. "Brendan, this is unexpected. I was in the neighborhood. Thought I'd grab coffee before my next appointment. Listen, my lawyers mentioned you still haven't signed the divorce papers. I'm not trying to pressure you, but dragging this out doesn't benefit either of us. What do you say we handle this like adults? Quick, clean, no drama." Every instinct screamed to tell him exactly what I thought of his definition of adult behavior. But I'd learned patience from months of building my case. Let him think I was compliant, defeated, moving on quietly. "I've been busy with work. I'll get to it soon." "Soon would be good," Brendan said, his smile showing teeth. "You seem like you're doing well, all things considered. I'm glad there's no hard feelings. That bet thing, it probably sounded worse than it was. You understand how guys are, right? Stupid competition, meaningless bragging rights. It wasn't personal." Wasn't personal. Those words crystallized everything wrong with Brendan's worldview. To him, using my emotions as currency in a gambling game wasn't personal, because I wasn't real enough to matter beyond my utility in his social theater. But I simply nodded, letting him believe his rationalization landed. "No hard feelings," I lied, and watched relief cross his features. He actually believed I was that compliant, that willing to swallow humiliation and move on. That confidence would be his downfall. The final 2 weeks before the gala were the hardest. Agent Torres confirmed that FBI agents would be positioned throughout the event, ready to move when evidence was presented. Dr. Mira Kendrick would be there as a representative of the state medical board, bringing authority to whatever happened. And I would be there as Nora Calloway, pediatric nurse and presenter of the Healthcare Hero Award to the man who'd gambled on my heartbreak. The night before the gala, I stood in my apartment trying on the midnight blue gown I'd bought with my own money. Not Brendan's loans, not borrowed finery, but something I'd earned. It fit perfectly, elegant without being ostentatious, the kind of dress that commanded respect rather than attention. Tomorrow, I would walk onto a stage in front of 300 witnesses and detonate the truth like a bomb. My phone buzzed with a final message from Agent Torres. "Ready? There's no going back after tomorrow." I looked at my reflection, seeing not the naive nurse who'd believed in fairy tales, but someone harder, sharper, forged in the fire of betrayal and tempered by months of methodical preparation. Tomorrow, Brendan would expect to receive an award celebrating his contributions to healthcare. What he'd receive instead was a reckoning 6 months in the making. I typed back, "Ready. See you there." So here's my question for you. If you had the power to expose someone who'd hurt you, but doing so meant publicly admitting how thoroughly you'd been deceived, would you take that risk? Would you choose justice over privacy? The Grand Meridian Ballroom transformed Providence General Hospital into something from a different world. Crystal chandeliers refracted light across 300 guests dressed in their finest evening wear. Tables adorned with white orchids and gold-rimmed china. Pharmaceutical company banners hung tastefully along the walls. Sponsors who'd paid premium prices for the privilege of associating their brands with healthcare excellence. Brendan's company logo featured prominently near the stage, a constant reminder of who held power in these spaces. I arrived early, checking in with Janine near the backstage entrance. She looked elegant in a charcoal gown, but tension lined her features as she handed me the evening's program. You're presenting third, right after the research grant announcements. The Healthcare Hero Award is one of the evening's main attractions. They'll have all cameras on you. Good, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The more witnesses, the better. Through the curtain gap, I could see guests filtering in. Dr. Mira Kendrick sat at a table near the front, positioned strategically with members of the state medical board. Her eyes scanned the room with professional assessment, identifying exits and sightlines. Agent Raymond Torres stood near the bar in formal wear that almost disguised the fact that he was working. His attention focused on entry points where 3 other agents I'd been introduced to were stationed. Everything was in place. Everyone knew their roles. Now it was just a matter of whether I could actually follow through. Brendan arrived fashionably late, making an entrance with his mother, Evelyn, on one arm. She wore diamonds that could fund a pediatric wing renovation, her expression radiating satisfaction at being seen in the right circles. Sienna Marlowe followed behind them, dressed in red silk that announced her presence like a declaration. She wasn't hiding anymore. Either Brendan had grown bolder about their relationship, or he simply didn't care who saw them together, now that he assumed our divorce was a foregone conclusion. I watched Brendan work the room with practiced ease, shaking hands with hospital board members, laughing with pharmaceutical executives, playing the role of successful industry leader who genuinely cared about healthcare advancement. Several doctors approached him with obvious deference, and I wondered how many of them had accepted his company's consulting fees in exchange for prescription cooperation. How many had compromised patient care because Brendan made it seem reasonable, profitable, just good business practice? Trent Holloway stood near Brendan's table, drink in hand, looking every inch the successful corporate lawyer. He drafted the betting contract, made Brendan's cruelty legally binding, and probably never lost a moment of sleep over it. To people like Trent, everything was just a transaction, a negotiation. A game where other people's humanity was reduced to contract terms and payout structures. The evening's program began with welcome speeches from hospital administrators, thanking sponsors and donors for their continued support. The crowd applauded politely, most people more interested in their appetizers and wine than the ceremonial formalities. I waited backstage, clutching the USB drive that contained everything: audio files, photographs, email chains, bank records, witness statements. 6 months of investigation compressed into digital evidence that would either change everything or destroy my credibility completely. You don't have to do this, Janine whispered as the research grant presentations concluded. Even now you could walk away, present the award normally, let the system handle this through proper channels. No one would blame you for choosing the safer path. I thought about that safer path, signing divorce papers, accepting humiliation privately, trusting that justice would eventually find its way through bureaucratic processes that favored people with resources and connections. I thought about the children in my pediatric wing, the ones receiving unnecessary medications because pharmaceutical profit margins mattered more than appropriate care. I thought about every other person Brendan had probably manipulated, every other target for his games and schemes. The system works slowly, I said quietly, sometimes too slowly for the people it's supposed to protect. Tonight, the system gets a jump start. The MC's voice carried through the ballroom. And now, to present our Healthcare Hero Award, recognizing outstanding contributions to pediatric treatment access, please welcome Providence General's own Nora Calloway. The applause felt distant as I walked onto the stage, heels clicking against polished wood. Spotlight glare made it difficult to see individual faces in the crowd. But I could feel their attention focusing, sense the shift from polite interest to confusion as they processed who I was. Some of them knew me from the hospital, the pediatric nurse who worked double shifts and rarely made waves. Others recognized me from wedding announcements and society page mentions of Brendan's marriage. Very few understood what they were about to witness. Brendan's table was close enough that I could see his expression clearly. Initial confusion gave way to shock, then to something harder as he calculated what my presence meant. Sienna leaned toward him, whispering urgently. Evelyn's face had frozen into aristocratic disapproval. Trent set down his wine glass with deliberate care, his lawyer instincts clearly screaming warnings. "Good evening," I began, my voice amplified by microphone and adrenaline. "I'm Nora Calloway, pediatric ICU nurse here at Providence General. I've worked in this hospital for 7 years, caring for the most vulnerable patients we serve, children fighting for their lives, families desperate for hope, medical professionals dedicated to healing." The crowd settled into attentive silence, expecting the standard award presentation rhetoric about healthcare excellence and community service. I let them settle, let the anticipation build before continuing. "I'm also Brendan Ashford's wife." Pause for the gasps, the whispers, the sudden tension that rippled through 300 people. Though technically, I should say, ex-wife. We divorced 6 months ago. During our honeymoon, actually. 3 days into our marriage, Brendan presented me with divorce papers poolside at a luxury resort in Bali. Brendan half rose from his seat, face draining of color. Trent put a restraining hand on his shoulder. Agent Torres moved closer to their table, positioning himself for intervention if needed. Dr. Mira Kendrick caught my eye from her seat, giving the slightest nod of encouragement. "Now, you might wonder what that personal history has to do with tonight's award ceremony," I continued, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "The answer is everything. Because Brendan didn't divorce me due to incompatibility or irreconcilable differences. He divorced me to win a $10,000 bet." The ballroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Camera flashes erupted from the media section. I pulled out a small remote from my evening bag, clicking to project the first piece of evidence on the screens positioned around the ballroom. Brendan's voice filled the space. Crystal clear audio captured by my phone on that Bali afternoon. "I'll be straight with you because you've been decent enough, and I don't want to drag this out. About 18 months ago, I made a bet with my fraternity brothers. $10,000 that I couldn't marry someone completely outside my usual type within a year. You were perfect. Wholesome nurse. No family drama to complicate things. Just ambitious enough to be flattered by the attention, but not worldly enough to see it coming." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the servers frozen in place, the entire ballroom suspended in collective disbelief. I let Brendan's recorded words hang in the air. Let them sink into the consciousness of everyone who'd gathered to celebrate healthcare heroism. "That's Brendan's voice," I said unnecessarily, "recorded 6 months ago during our honeymoon. But audio can be dismissed as out of context, so let me show you the documentation." Click. The betting contract appeared on screen. The Ashford Initiative, in professional formatting, complete with legal clauses and signature lines. I zoomed in on specific sections: the timeline requirements, the payout structure, the proof of divorce stipulations. Most damning of all, Trent Holloway's name at the bottom, his law firm letterhead validating this document's legal legitimacy. "A licensed attorney drafted a contract gambling on marriage and divorce," I explained to the transfixed crowd. "That alone raises questions about professional ethics. But this evening isn't about a personal bet. It's about what I discovered while investigating my own humiliation." Click. Bank statements filled the screens. Our honeymoon fund showing $47,000 in suspicious transfers. Click. Receipts from luxury resorts, dates corresponding to Brendan's claimed business conferences, all showing 2 guests despite his assurances that these were solo professional trips. Click. Security footage stills from hospital parking garages, time-stamped images of Brendan with Sienna Marlowe during hours he'd claimed to be in meetings. "Affairs happen," I said, watching Evelyn's face contort with rage and embarrassment. People make relationship choices for complicated reasons. But what concerned me more was what else I found in Brendan's financial records. transfers that didn't match any legitimate business purpose, email communications that suggested systematic corruption of medical practice. Agent Torres was moving now, positioning himself and his team around exits. Dr. Mira Kendrick stood, her presence lending official weight to whatever came next. Several board members looked like they wanted to intervene, but were frozen by the magnitude of what was unfolding. Click. Email chains appeared. Brendan coordinating with pharmaceutical company executives about prescriber compliance rates and market penetration strategies. Messages discussing doctors by name, evaluating their willingness to push medications beyond appropriate medical guidelines. Conversations about bonus structures tied not to patient outcomes, but to prescription volumes. These emails detail systematic fraud, I continued, my voice taking on the clinical precision I used when documenting critical patient information. Kickback schemes disguised as consulting fees, incentive programs that reward doctors for prescribing medications patients may not need. Off-label usage pressures that prioritize pharmaceutical profit over patient safety. Click. Spreadsheets showing correlation between Brendan's sales territory and dramatic spikes in specific pediatric prescriptions. Increases that didn't correspond to any changes in medical necessity or disease prevalence. Charts demonstrating how hospitals where Brendan had major accounts showed prescription patterns that defied evidence-based medicine. Over the last 6 months, I've worked with medical ethics investigators and federal law enforcement to document $2.3 million in insurance fraud, I said, letting that number sink in. $2.3 million stolen from healthcare systems, ultimately paid by patients and taxpayers, generated through systematic manipulation of prescriber behavior. Brendan stood fully now, pointing at me with shaking finger. This is a vindictive witch hunt by an ex-wife with an axe to grind. You're twisting legitimate business practices into... Mr. Ashford, Agent Torres's voice, cut through Brendan's protest with official authority. I'm going to need you to sit down. Federal agents are positioned throughout this room, and we have warrants for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud under RICO statutes. The ballroom exploded into chaos. Cameras flashed continuously. Guests shouted questions. Evelyn screamed something about lawsuits and defamation. Sienna tried to slip toward an exit, but found her path blocked by another agent. Trent was on his phone, presumably calling lawyers. His face pale with the realization that his involvement in the betting contract had just become public record in front of witnesses who included state medical board officials. Dr. Mira Kendrick took the stage beside me, her official credentials lending institutional weight to the accusations. On behalf of the State Medical Board, I can confirm that the evidence Ms. Calloway has presented aligns with an ongoing investigation into pharmaceutical fraud affecting multiple hospital networks. We have corroborating documentation, witness statements from medical professionals, and financial records that establish a pattern of systematic corruption. Click. My final slide appeared. Witness statements from 3 pediatric nurses. Their names redacted for privacy, but their testimony damning. Stories of pressure to administer medications they'd questioned. Descriptions of pharmaceutical reps making inappropriate promises. Accounts of Brendan specifically leveraging relationships with hospital administrators to override clinical judgment. These nurses risked their careers to come forward, I said, looking directly at Brendan as agents moved toward his table. They prioritized patient safety over job security. They chose to be brave when staying silent would have been easier. Everything they've testified to is documented, verified, and legally actionable. Brendan was being handcuffed now, the scene surreal against the backdrop of crystal chandeliers and elegant evening wear. Evelyn shrieked about calling their family attorneys, about how this was a misunderstanding that money could resolve. Sienna was crying, mascara running, as she tried to explain to agents that she'd only followed company policy, that she didn't know the incentive programs were illegal. Trent was arguing with another agent about attorney-client privilege and improper evidence disclosure, but his voice lacked conviction. The betting contract on screen behind him made clear that his legal expertise had been used to facilitate harm, not justice. Multiple state bar officials were in attendance. Trent's career implications were just beginning to unfold. Healthcare Hero Award, I said into the microphone, my voice carrying over the chaos. We were supposed to celebrate Brendan Ashford's contributions to pediatric treatment access tonight. Instead, we're documenting how he exploited pediatric treatment for profit, how he manipulated medical professionals, how he betrayed every principle that genuine healthcare heroes stand for. I held up the award plaque that was supposed to bear Brendan's name, then set it face down on the podium. This award will not be presented tonight. Instead, I'm recommending that the hospital redirect the recognition to the nurses and doctors who've come forward to expose fraud, the real heroes who chose patient welfare over professional advancement. Agent Torres was escorting Brendan toward the exit now, reading him his Miranda rights in tones that cut through the ballroom's cacophony. Brendan tried to maintain dignity, to walk with his head high, but the handcuffs and federal charges made dignity impossible. He caught my eye as he passed the stage, and for the first time since I'd known him, his expression showed something genuine. Not charm or calculation, but pure, unfiltered recognition that he'd catastrophically underestimated me. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of media interviews, legal depositions, and official statements. News coverage was relentless. Honeymoon. Betrayal exposes pharmaceutical fraud ring, screamed headlines across regional and national outlets. Video of Brendan's arrest at the gala went viral, analyzed by legal experts and healthcare commentators. My face appeared on news broadcasts as I provided carefully worded statements about evidence collection and federal cooperation. Brendan's pharmaceutical company stock crashed 40% in the first trading day after the gala. 7 doctors across 3 states were placed on administrative leave while their prescription patterns underwent investigation. The state medical board announced sweeping audits of pharmaceutical company relationships with hospital networks. Insurance companies filed civil suits seeking recovery of fraudulently billed amounts. Sienna Marlowe was terminated from her pharmaceutical sales position and had her professional licenses suspended pending investigation into her role in the kickback schemes. Without Brendan to protect her, she became vulnerable to the same scrutiny he'd orchestrated for others. The affair that had seemed so glamorous in Bali became evidence of conspiracy, their relationship timeline corroborating patterns of coordinated fraud. Trent Holloway faced ethics complaints with the State Bar Association. Drafting the betting contract might have been dismissed as poor judgment if it existed in isolation, but presented alongside evidence of his knowledge about Brendan's pharmaceutical fraud. It painted a picture of systematic ethical failures. His corporate law practice began hemorrhaging clients who didn't want association with someone whose name appeared in federal fraud indictments. Evelyn Ashford retreated from public life as her socialite friends quietly distanced themselves. Charity boards where she'd held positions requested her resignation. Country club memberships lapsed without renewal. The family name she'd wielded like aristocratic armor became a liability in circles, where reputation mattered more than wealth. Providence. General Hospital's response was swift and strategic. The board issued statements emphasizing their commitment to ethical pharmaceutical relationships and patient-first care. They announced the creation of a new position, Chief Ethics Officer, responsible for overseeing all external vendor relationships, ensuring compliance with medical guidelines, and providing transparent channels for staff to report concerns without fear of retaliation. Janine called me into her office 3 days after the gala, closing the door with unusual formality. "The board wants to offer you the Chief Ethics Officer position," she said, without preamble. "Comprehensive salary package, full administrative authority, direct reporting to the board rather than through department hierarchies. You'd have resources to build the kind of oversight that prevents what Brendan did from happening again." I stared at her, struggling to process how thoroughly my life had transformed in 72 hours. I'm a pediatric nurse. I don't have administrative experience or ethics training beyond basic nursing requirements. You have something more valuable, Janine countered. You have moral courage and investigative instincts that professional credentials can't teach. You turned personal betrayal into systemic reform. That's exactly the mindset we need in this role. Obviously, we'd provide training, continuing education, whatever support you need. But the foundation, the willingness to prioritize right over easy, to risk personal cost for public benefit, that's already there. The offer felt surreal, like I'd stepped through a portal into an alternate reality where betrayal became opportunity. But looking at Janine's expression, I understood this wasn't charity or sympathy. It was recognition that I'd proven myself capable of exactly what the position required. Can I think about it? I asked, knowing my answer, but needing time to let the magnitude settle. Take a week, Janine said. Though I should mention that 3 other hospital networks have already reached out, asking if you'd be interested in consulting on their pharmaceutical oversight programs. Your phone is about to get very busy. She was right. By week's end, I had offers from institutions across the state wanting me to audit their vendor relationships, review prescription patterns, establish reporting mechanisms for staff concerned about external pressures. The expertise I developed through investigating my own humiliation had apparently become valuable professional currency. 6 months after the gala, I sat in my new office, spacious corner suite on the administrative floor with views of the city skyline and walls lined with medical ethics certifications I'd earned through intensive continuing education. My desk held 3 framed items: my original nursing license from 7 years ago, the Pediatric Excellence Award I'd received 2 years into my career, and a photograph of me with a group of young patients from the ICU. The children's faces reminded me why this work mattered, why systematic fraud wasn't just an abstract legal concept, but a violation of trust that affected the most vulnerable. Brendan's trial was scheduled to begin in 3 weeks. Federal prosecutors felt confident about conviction. The evidence was overwhelming, the witness testimony corroborated, the financial documentation incontrovertible. He faced 15 to 20 years in federal prison, his pharmaceutical career destroyed, his reputation permanently shattered. The $10,000 bet that was supposed to validate his cleverness had cost him everything that actually mattered. Trent had been disbarred after a state bar ethics hearing found that drafting the betting contract demonstrated moral unfitness for legal practice. His corporate law firm dissolved, unable to retain clients once his name became synonymous with ethical corruption. Last I'd heard, he was working paralegal positions under a different attorney's supervision. His career trajectory permanently redirected. Sienna faced multiple civil suits from insurance companies seeking to recover fraudulent billing amounts. Without Brendan's resources or connections, she was vulnerable to the full weight of financial consequences. Her pharmaceutical sales career was finished, her professional reputation destroyed beyond repair. Evelyn had moved to her family's estate in Connecticut, avoiding social circles where the Ashford name now carried stigma instead of prestige. The diamonds she'd worn to the gala had been sold to help fund Brendan's legal defense, a defense that multiple attorneys had warned stood little chance of success given the evidence against him. My phone buzzed with a new message from Dr. Pearl. Honey, Mira, Kendrick. New case developing. Orthopedic device fraud, similar kickback patterns. Interested in consulting? Good pay, complex investigation, right up your alley. I smiled, already knowing my answer. The work I'd stumbled into through betrayal had become my calling, using systematic documentation and strategic exposure to dismantle corruption that hid behind professional respectability. Each case was different, but shared common DNA. Powerful people exploiting trusted positions, vulnerable populations paying the price. Institutional systems moving too slowly to protect those who needed protection most. My response to Mira was brief. Send me the preliminary files. When do we start? Another message arrived. This one from a hospital network in Boston requesting a comprehensive pharmaceutical relationship audit, then another from a medical ethics journal asking if I'd be interested in publishing an article about systematic fraud detection. The afternoon stretched ahead with meetings, reviews, strategy sessions for oversight improvements. But first, I took a moment to look at my reflection in the office window. The woman staring back wasn't the naive bride who'd believed in fairy tales, wasn't the heartbroken nurse who'd considered staying silent to avoid embarrassment. She was someone who'd learned that the worst betrayals could become catalysts for the most meaningful work. That personal pain transformed into public accountability could change systems that harmed countless people. Brendan had bet $10,000 that I could be manipulated, used, and discarded. He'd gambled on my naivety, my trust, my desperation to believe someone valued me. What he failed to calculate was that underestimating someone doesn't make them weak. It makes them dangerous once they recognize their own strength. His bet had cost him everything: his freedom, his career, his reputation, his future. Mine had cost me a fairy tale delusion I'd never actually needed. In return, I'd gained purpose that extended far beyond personal revenge: authority to protect vulnerable patients from people who saw them as profit centers, and expertise that let me fight battles I hadn't known existed 6 months ago. The numbers told their own story. 15 pediatric patients at Providence General alone had been prescribed medications they didn't need. Their young bodies subjected to unnecessary side effects because pharmaceutical profit margins mattered more than their well-being. Across the 3-state investigation, that number climbed to over 400 children. 400 families who trusted that medical advice came from clinical judgment rather than financial incentives. Now, those families would receive compensation from settlement funds, and, more importantly, their children's medical records would be corrected to reflect actual diagnoses rather than manufactured conditions designed to justify prescriptions. I'd also learned something valuable about myself during those 6 months of investigation. The woman who'd believed she needed someone like Brendan to validate her worth had discovered she'd always possessed value. She'd just been looking for confirmation in the wrong places. My colleagues respected my clinical judgment long before I married a pharmaceutical executive. My patients' families had trusted me for 7 years because I'd earned that trust through competence and compassion, not connections. The promotion to Chief Ethics Officer wasn't nepotism or lucky timing. It was recognition of skills I developed through years of documentation, patient advocacy, and refusing to accept substandard care, even when easier options existed. Sometimes, the worst thing that happens to us becomes the catalyst for the best thing we ever do. Brendan thought he'd written the ending to our story when he slid those divorce papers across that infinity pool. He was wrong. That was just the beginning of my career, my purpose, my transformation from someone who believed in fairy tales to someone who created accountability. The phone rang. Agent Torres. I answered on the second ring. Nora, trial dates confirmed. Prosecution wants to meet next week to prep your testimony. Also, the judge approved our motion to include evidence from the 3 additional hospitals where similar patterns were documented. You were right about the scope. This goes way beyond Meridian Pharmaceuticals. We're looking at industry-wide implications. Good, I said, and meant it. Send me the prep schedule. I'll be ready. After we hung up, I stood at my window watching the city below. Hospitals and office buildings where people worked, where patients trusted that care decisions were made in their best interests, where fraud still occurred in shadows, because most people preferred not to look too closely at uncomfortable truths. But I was looking now, and I wasn't alone. Dr. Mira Kendrick, Agent Torres, the State Medical Board, whistleblowers and witnesses who found courage when they saw someone else willing to risk exposure. Together, we were dismantling systems that had functioned through silence and complicity for decades. My computer chimed with another message. this time from the hospital board chairman. Ethics Committee wants your input on new pharmaceutical company interaction guidelines. Can you lead the task force? I typed a quick acceptance and saved the draft of my opening presentation, already forming arguments for why transparency mattered more than comfortable relationships with industry sponsors. This was my life now. Not dramatic gala revelations, but persistent, methodical work that slowly changed systems, one policy at a time. The midnight blue gown from that night hung in my closet at home, dry cleaned and preserved not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Reminder that justice wasn't always loud and public, that most battles were fought in committee meetings and policy revisions, and patient advocacy that nobody would ever photograph. But sometimes, public reckoning was necessary to crack open systems that thrived in darkness. Brendan Ashford had bet I was too nice to be dangerous. He'd gambled. That kindness meant weakness. That trust meant gullibility. That people who cared about others could be easily manipulated. He'd been wrong on every count. And now, with each case I worked, each fraud I helped expose, each patient whose care became slightly safer because someone was watching, now I was proving exactly how expensive his $10,000 bet had become. Not just for him, but for every person who looked at vulnerable people and saw profit margins instead of human beings deserving protection and respect. The woman who'd stood beside that infinity pool in Bali, holding divorce papers and wondering how her fairy tale had shattered so completely, she was gone. In her place was someone harder, sharper, infinitely more dangerous to people who built careers on manipulation and exploitation. Brendan's bet had destroyed him. But it had built me into exactly the kind of person he should have feared from the beginning. And as I looked at that empty USB drive waiting to document the next case, I smiled.